Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News Weekend. A landmark decision by the Supreme Court on Friday affirming Indigenous child welfare rights. Quebec had challenged a 2019 law brought in by the Trudeau government. That law gave control to Indigenous communities over their own child and family services. It also set out minimum standards of care. Now Canada's top court has dismissed Quebec's appeal and upholding that law. This follows a ruling that BC already made a few years ago.
What it means from here on is that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis groups who are ready to take down child welfare may do so, and do so with that foundation of culture, to increase that cultural knowledge for children and families, to give the support of extended families and communities, just as BC has already done. BC already implemented this in 2022. First Nations can operate their own child welfare organizations in BC.
Now, for more on the decision, we spoke with Cindy Blackstock, the head of the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society. Blackstock is one of Canada's leading advocates for children, and she has her own history with the Supreme Court. Cindy, always awesome to have you with us. Just your initial reaction to this decision here today.
Well, you know, this was an incredible victory for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit kids in that it affirmed the national standards and saying, look, no more harming kids in legislation and other policies with child welfare. All governments have to do better. That's a good thing. And then in addition to that, of course, affirming the decision-making of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children for their kids. All of this great decision, though, you know what I always say, it's a great dream, but to make it a reality, we got to make sure governments implement these things. And right now we have a non-compliance order, for example, against the Canadian government for breaching Jordan's principal orders. And so they need to bring their actions in alignment with this judgment and the requirements of the Act respecting First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children, youth, and families.
Yes, Cindy, when you talk about implementation, I guess what would be the next steps here?
Well, I'm hoping that what we're going to be seeing is Canada actually affirming that First Nations laws have application across all provincial jurisdictions. There's been this tendency for them to say, well, it only applies in the province where the First Nation is. That should be out the window. Number two, they need to comply with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders fully so that those national standards are met for First Nations communities, and make sure that those hard-fought wins on Jordan's Principle and Child and Family are a baseline level of funding for First Nations, regardless of what jurisdictional model they want to achieve. Because the bottom line is every First Nation wants to make sure that their children grow up healthy and proud in keeping with those standards.
Cindy, what do you think this decision could mean to the average child in provincial care?
Well, it could mean that they no longer spend their childhoods trying to get basic rights that other kids enjoy. But that'll depend on the implementation of it. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to do more services to get at those core drivers of the overrepresentation. Things like poverty, poor housing, the trauma from colonialism that leads to addictions and domestic violence. Those are the big issues, Dennis, that we have to get at to make a big difference in the lives of children and their families. I'm hoping that this decision really breaks that open and gets people laser focused on that work. Because without it, sadly, we're going to see the overrepresentation continue, and that's not fair to kids.
Cindy, we'll have to leave it there. Always a pleasure to spend some time with you.
Hey, thanks so much, Dennis.
In Winnipeg, 2 parents have been charged with manslaughter after their 1-year-old daughter died nearly 1 year ago with high levels of fentanyl intoxication. Tamara Pimentel has more, and a warning: this story may be disturbing to some.
In March 2023, the Winnipeg Police Services Child Abuse Unit opened an investigation into the sudden death of 1-year-old Hannah Boulette. Toxicology and autopsy reports determined her death was caused by high levels of fentanyl intoxication. Gary Bruce and Sabrina Boulette were both charged with manslaughter and taken into custody. When the incident happened in March, police say the child's father called 911 after his daughter became unresponsive at their home. Paramedics gave the child CPR and she was taken to hospital where she was pronounced dead. At the time, both parents were arrested for criminal negligence causing death, and Bruce was also charged with possession of a controlled substance, and they were both released. Investigators later determined that the parents gave little detail of the incident and had been present and aware of Hannah's fentanyl exposure. Police say they waited several hours before calling 911.
The amount of time that had passed from where the parents were aware of the child's fentanyl exposure to the time that 911 was called was certainly a factor that may have played in the child's death.
WPS Constable Claude Chansey says this brings last year's homicide count for Winnipeg to 44.
We're seeing more of these incidents come through, and this is not just particular to Winnipeg. There's more occurrences you'll have noticed in other parts of Canada, and for us it's a very concerning thing.
Chansey says both parents have had contact with police in the past and were using drugs when Hannah was exposed to fentanyl. The charges against the parents have not been tested in court. Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
To Ottawa now, and there was a fiery debate over the Trudeau government's new First Nations Clean Water Act in the House of Commons on Monday. And things got even more heated after a Conservative MP gave his 2 cents during debate. APTN's Fraser Needham has that story.
Water quality is a problem on many First Nations, and the proposed Bill C-61 is supposed to do something about that by protecting water sources, creating minimum drinking water standards, and providing sustainable funding for water quality on First Nations. During debate in Parliament on Monday, Saskatoon Conservative MP Kevin Waugh had this to say.
You know, the previous Conservative government left 8.5 years ago. We still have over 100 water advisories on First Nations. In my province of Saskatchewan, I've seen reserves burn down water treatment plants because this government has done little or nothing.
Waugh went on further.
And the other thing, Madam Speaker, is these water treatment plants need education, and they need people on reserve to operate the water treatment plants. And that's part of the problem that we've seen with this government the last 8.5 years.
Indigenous Services Minister Patty Haidu responded.
Well, Madam Speaker, trust a Conservative member to blame First Nations people for burning down their own water treatment plants and not being smart enough to be able to understand how to operate those plants. That's the kind of paternalism, Madam Speaker, that led to 105 long-term boil water advisories. They just weren't worth investing in, I guess.
The Liberals have been criticized for failing to live up to a 2015 commitment to eliminate all long-term drinking water advisories on First Nations by 2021. According to the Indigenous Services Canada website, there were 28 long-term drinking water advisories in place on First Nations as of January 19th of this year. 5 of these were in Saskatchewan. Bill C-61, which was introduced just before Christmas, is supposed to bring the government closer to meeting this commitment. But Haidu continued to take issue with Waugh's comments in particular on Tuesday.
Well, the implication that people would burn water treatment plants out of spite, out of anger at the government, out of a sense of, wanton destruction, I think came through loud and clear in his comments. And I will just say that we see acts of arson in non-Indigenous communities as well. So there is a stereotype that somehow Indigenous people don't take care of the equipment or their housing or their community infrastructure, and that is a long-standing, very harmful and hurtful stereotype.
APTN News reached out to Kevin Waugh's office, asking him to provide clarity for his comments from the previous day, but did not hear back by airtime. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Now, in a statement to APTN News, Waugh's office said he, quote, raised concerns about 2 incidents on reserves in Saskatchewan publicly reported in the media that saw water treatment plants burned down, disrupting clean water access for First Nations families. He is not familiar with the specific circumstances of these incidents and did not intend to make any implication about the cause, end quote. To Thunder Bay now, where policing was one of the topics that came up at the annual Anishinaabe Aski Nation Chiefs Assembly. NAN represents 49 First Nations in Northern Ontario. Also on hand was Ontario's Deputy Solicitor General. Chief Christopher Muñez of Niskantaga First Nation raised his concerns over the recent Thunder Bay police response to a missing 14-year-old girl from his nation who was found deceased days later.
Right throughout that time we were doing our searches. On December 16th, I went to this area where this youth has gone, but was missing, where she went missing. And no police there, nobody responded, nobody came to see us, nobody came to see the family. You know, that's how Thunder Bay, that's how we get treated here in Thunder Bay. There's no response, lack of response, and there's not only in Niskantaga. It's almost for every community that comes here, every citizen from NAN that comes here. We get mistreated. There's no response. We don't get the respect. What are you prepared to do to Thunder Bay Police to make sure they are accountable and responsible?
Deputy Solicitor General Mario D. Tomaso responded to Chief Muñez. He said a new entity known as the Office of the Inspector General of Policing will be up and running by April 1st and will have substantial powers.
So in the situation that you described, Thunder Bay is not providing said service adequately and effectively, and it is not acceptable. So based on information that the Inspector General of Policing would have, that Inspector General could launch an inspection and an investigation on Thunder Bay Police and then issue orders to the Thunder Bay Police Services Board and to the Thunder Bay Police Services to improve service delivery with respect to the complaint that has been made.
Winter roads leading to First Nations in Manitoba are struggling during these warmer temperatures. Details coming up after the break. Welcome back. The Senate Committee on Indigenous Peoples heard from Saskatchewan's Chief Coroner, Clive Wayhill, on Wednesday night. He was part of the study about organizations that have not yet released their records on children who attended Indian residential schools. APTN's Rachel May has more.
Before 2015, the record-keeping process for those who died in residential schools was entirely on paper. In 2015, Wayhill's team gathered boxes of files from across the province to begin the process of accurately cataloging them.
We didn't slow down on it at all. We made sure that we could live up to what our commitment was.
The Coroner Service has partnered with the National Truth and Reconciliation Centre to help identify residential school children who never made it home. A spreadsheet was created with file numbers, ages, gender, place of birth, date of death, and cause of death. Wayhill's office completed over 400 searches of the approximately 600 names provided by the Truth and Reconciliation Centre, and they're ready for more.
But we do have enough information that we could certainly match names up should we receive any further names.
Wayhill says the coroner's office only investigates unnatural deaths like murder, suicide, fire, drowning, and overdoses. If people want to know more about residential school students who died of natural causes, Saskatchewan's Vital Statistics has that information. Rachel May, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
A new environmental study by Yale University and the Government of Canada shows that emissions from the Alberta oil sands facilities are many times higher than what was being reported. But the findings are no surprise to Athabasca Chippewa Chief Alan Adam. APTN's Chris Stewart has that story.
The study began in 2018 with researchers from Yale and Environment Canada measuring carbon gases emitted by 17 facilities in the Athabasca oil sands by flying over them. Industry records emissions at ground level. What they found was emissions were 19 to 64 times higher than what the facility owners were reporting. John Leggio is a scientist with the federal government. He co-authored the study. He says he believes there are more tools that industry can use to get more accurate readings.
It's probably not feasible to be flying a plane, every month for a whole year with all of the very expensive and complex instrumentation that we were using on the aircraft. But we did have some novel instruments that are relatively simple that showed us that there was a discrepancy between the total that we measure and the total that is reported.
He says the emissions are not the greenhouse gases that lead to climate change, but they can lead to health issues downwind of the sites.
So the issue with having these high emissions is that ultimately all of these gas phase compounds end up forming particulate matter downwind, sometimes near, sometimes far, and along the way. And PM, we know, is a health issue around the world. It's similar. The PM is similar to PM that you would expect to be exposed to, for example, from forest fire smoke.
APTN spoke to Chief Alan Adam of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation in northern Alberta. He says the report is no surprise to him.
We've been doing our own community-based monitoring program since probably way back in 2010, 2009. We do water sampling and everything and stuff like that. And, we've been finding samples of abnormality. I guess it's not right in the ecosystem and stuff like that. And this just confirms the fact that what they found, we've been finding all along.
Adam says industry and government need to talk to Indigenous peoples to find a solution.
The report is astonishing when you look at it. Does it really have to be that way? Could it have been done differently? I think, in our view, it could have done a lot better if we had just did what we told industry all along, what needed to get done, because the First Nations were right all along.
In a statement, the Alberta Ministry of Environment said that in the past decade, per barrel emissions have dropped 21%, and another 23% drop is expected in the next decade. It goes on to say, we stand by our province's regulatory and monitoring approach while recognizing that we need to keep learning and evolving. It does not mention any upcoming meetings to discuss the report's findings. Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
Winter roads in northern Manitoba are melting due to warmer weather, and that has some remote First Nations in the province calling for a state of emergency. Sav Jonza has more.
4 First Nations in remote northern Manitoba are declaring a state of emergency due to the quick deterioration of their winter road network, the only way in or out of the communities by land.
Right now, the winter roads that have been completed are deteriorating to a point where one chief told me that driving on their winter road is like driving on a sponge.
Relying on winter roads to receive fuels, food, and construction equipment has become difficult due to unseasonably warm weather. Close to 1,000 semi-truckloads of essential goods are delayed getting to the Island Lake communities of St. Teresa Point, Garden Hill, Red Sucker Lake, and Wasagamacq Ansinan Nations because of the conditions. Charles Knott is the chief for Garden Hill First Nation.
We haven't gotten any loads in this year. Our winter roads are not even open yet. The winter road crew are still battling trying to open the winter roads. It's just unreal how the climate has changed this year. And I'm very concerned that I just got word from my community that we only have about a week left of our field.
Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs Grand Chief Kathy Merrick says First Nations peoples are feeling the impacts of climate change.
First Nations people are among the lowest contributors to greenhouse emissions in this country. Yet research shows they're among the most exposed to climate change and the impacts of climate change.
Her and the other chiefs have called on the province to declare a state of emergency to assist the communities.
They can no longer wait. When it rains in February in this province, they need the help, they need the assistance now.
The state of emergency declaration comes a week after the same First Nations proposed a 252-kilometer all-season road to connect to Barons River First Nation. Sav Jonza, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
A major housing shortage in BC is getting some relief thanks to a massive new First Nations-led development. That story's coming up after the break. Welcome back. Vancouver City Council has given the green light for 3 First Nations to develop on their traditional lands that will have a major impact in helping the housing shortage. APTN's Tina House has more.
We have some carvings right here as like little street posts, and obviously the totem poles. When people walk through the streets of Yelmo, they'll inherently know in the back of their minds, oh, this is the land of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh.
In 2016, the 3 First Nations surrounding the city of Vancouver bought 90 acres of land and a $480 million deal with the federal government. It's in a prime location across the street from Jericho Beach and was once the village site of Yelmouth, where many nations would gather. It sat empty until now. The city of Vancouver has approved the 3 nations to develop on their land that is going to change the beleaguered rental housing market in Vancouver. These artist renderings show what it will eventually look like, including 13,000 rentals subsidized in private condos that will welcome 24,000 residents. Spaces for commercial, light industrial, and retail businesses are expected to create over 3,000 new jobs. Childcare spaces, parks, and culturally significant social spaces, including artist studios for carving, weaving, and other activities, is going to be established. A non-traditional library and ceremonial gathering place is also part of the plan. Chief Jen Thomas of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation says she is proud of all the work to make this project happen.
Housing's a big issue for everybody, not just us on reserves. You know, we don't have space on the reserves, so this gives us an opportunity for our members even just to move back to Vancouver. You know, and it's going to be safe, affordable homes. It's going to be a market home.
So bringing on to the next generation.
William George Thomas is a cultural liaison for all 3 nations, and he was a part of the planning process.
All of the artists from all Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh are going to be all over the project, and it's really going to try and illustrate the story of Yelmo, which is where Jericho is, the story of Yelmo and how Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh have historically always been here.
It's very exciting. You know, this is a dream come true, and I'm going to go back to late Leonard George. You know, this is one of his biggest dreams, the 3 nations to come together and be developers like this in our own shared territory. I know he's smiling down on us right now.
The project will take place in phases over the next 25 to 30 years. Tina House, APTN National News, North Vancouver.
Looks pretty cool. That's all the time we have for your APTN National News this weekend. For news anytime, you can visit our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Marcy McGuitch, thanks for being with us. Enjoy your Super Bowl weekend.